Thanks for listening, everyone. I'm Dimitra Janakoulias, and I'm a state coordinator for Braver Angels Oregon. If you're new to Braver Angels, we're a grassroots organization dedicated to restoring civic health and reducing partisan conflict. Today I'm speaking with Ryan Nakade, a mediator and trainer who designs and delivers workshops on dialogue, depolarization, and de-escalation through his business, Ruminant Resolutions. Recently, Ryan also worked as a project coordinator with the organization Cure Violence Global. On top of all that, he's the proud owner of a small goat farm in Toledo, Washington. Ryan, thanks for being here. I'm so excited to talk with you because you've been one of my role models in the depolarization space. So, my goal in this conversation is to have more people get to hear some of your thoughts and perspectives about politics, society, and culture.
Thank you. And likewise, Dimitra, you're also one of my role models and one of my favorite people in the depolarization space. And I know a lot of people in this space. So,
Thank you. All right, so we'll get started. Tell us a little bit about your background, such as where did you grow up and what were some early influences that shaped you as a person?
well, I grew up in Hawaii, Japanese family, Japanese American. My dad's from Japan. My mom's third generation Japanese from her family backgrounds in Hawaii. My mom's a Buddhist minister. So I actually grew up in a Soto Zen Buddhist temple on the Big Island in Kona, which was a very
Wow.
unique kind of community experience being raised in that environment. And my parents are Democrat, blue, socially liberal people. Hawaii is a pretty blue state, although as we'll get into later, we do race and ideological kind of stuff very differently from on the mainland. But I would say that in terms of the Japanese and Buddhist environment I was raised in, I've been calling it the values that were instilled in me are kind of like culturally conservative values, right? So those are things like serving the community, civic order, personal responsibility, hard work, deference to authority, respect for elders, having a more strict or constraint oriented orientation towards things like raising kids, being very ashamed about causing shame to the family or the broader community. And these are values I would call kind of culturally conservative, things like serving your country or patriotism. And I didn't really find those same types of values when I moved to Portland. So that's what that kind of stuck with me for large, in large part, but probably pretty subconsciously. And my dad is an American history teacher, and he taught at a high school. But I was never really into politics or thinking about civics or society. I dropped out of high school 1 month into ninth grade, so I didn't learn about
Wow.
civics or follow a conventional educational path. So I didn't, yeah, and I was kind of in a kind of hippie spiritual phase up until like 22. So didn't follow politics, didn't know the difference between Democrats and Republicans and what anyone believed about anything. And then started getting into politics in 2014, actually. And so I did what any reasonable person would have done, as I joke. I binge watched the 2012 Republican debates to try to learn about what the heck all this political stuff was about. So this was like Newt Gingrich and Mitt Romney and Rick Santorum and Ron Paul. And it was like, oh, this is interesting. And at that time in 2012, Ron Paul was kind of a candidate that got a lot of energy, especially from young people. And I actually knew a kid who was really into Ron Paul. So I became very interested in libertarianism, started reading a lot of books on Austrian economics, and kind of had that worldview locked in for a good year and a half until I got my first real job at a Japanese living history museum. All of my colleagues were very liberal and they basically culturally pressured me into being a supporter of Bernie Sanders. So I did a 180, was a Ron Paul supporter, became a Bernie bro,
Oh my
and then
gosh.
moved to Portland in 2016 with my wife right before the election. So there was Portland culture shock. Then the election happened. The country was divided. And I'm thinking, this doesn't feel right. It seems like having a conversation with someone you disagree with shouldn't be hard. But for some people, it's perceived to be some kind of existential threat to who you are. I said, what the heck is going on here? So I kind of backed away from following the news and all of the specifics of what's going on and kind of started studying things like political theory and philosophy. And that's where I think a lot of my current worldview has been shaped.
So I just want to reiterate here, you dropped out of high school in ninth grade. but
Yes.
yet you read political philosophy and economics. And I also know you read a lot about science and psychology. And so you are possibly the most well-read person that I know. You don't have to be in school to have a good education.
Yes,
Um,
I like to think that.
just rewinding a little bit back to Hawaii, you said that, your experience of growing up there was culturally conservative with having traditional Japanese values in your household. They tend to be conservative, but your parents are politically liberal. And so you had a simultaneously kind of liberal upbringing and a conservative upbringing. Is that right?
Yeah, I would say that. I don't think that's how they would necessarily think about it because I think from a Japanese perspective, what would be considered to be culturally conservative in a liberal West Coast city like Portland or Seattle, for Japanese people, that's just normal, right? As you
Mm.
know, you spent time in Japan. So a lot of the Japanese norms and customs and values and ways we're socialized, they do code as being more conservative in the broad, mainstream West. And so when I moved to a rural area here, I noticed that in Washington, I noticed that a lot of the values that I've been instilled with, even though the content was different, the vibe or general themes were similar to a lot of rural conservative people that I live with now. So that's kind of an interesting thing I've been reflecting on.
You also mentioned that you alluded to growing up in Hawaii gave you a different experience of race than growing up, say, if you had grown up in the Northwest or on the mainland, that might have been different. What do you mean by that?
Oh, yes, we're going to open this can of worms. So, what the interesting thing about Hawaii is we are a melting pot. We are very diverse. We got the Hawaiians, we got the Filipinos, we got the Japanese, we got the Portuguese, we got that general haole, kind of thing going on. And we have all these little ethnic kind of subgroups and clusters. And, Oahu has even more diversity of different Polynesian backgrounds. And, we have a very big Latino and Mexican community where I grew up in the Big Island. A lot of my neighbors were Mexican and so forth. Marshall Island, Micronesian. And a lot of people do talk about race and ethnicity, but not in a way, it doesn't really feel like there's an ideological charge behind it. That's just normal folksy way of talking about things. I'll give you an example. When I got my first job at this Japanese Living History Museum, there was one of the gardeners was a older Filipino guy named Cirillo. And one of the ladies I was working with was like, "Oh, Cirillo, that Filipino MFer, and even though from our perspective, you would think, oh my God, that sounds really racist or whatever. But the context in which he said it, that's just like normal, like Hawaii trash talk. And there's not really a lot of tension around it. It's kind of a loose thing. Everyone kind of makes fun of each other. There's a lot of comedians who make jokes about the different ethnic groups and racial groups in Hawaii. So it's a lot more relaxed. And it's less of an abstract academic critical race theory kind of a thing. There are kind of like indigenous anti-colonialist movements in Hawaii that tend to come out of more academic contexts like the University of Hawaii and so forth. But I would say for most normal people in Hawaii, we do talk about race, we do talk about the haole people, but it's a very normal way of talking, and it doesn't feel like there's a political agenda behind it.
Interesting. What do you think makes it work?
I think there's I think several things. I think there is an island mentality or island sense of camaraderie, and so we're everyone is living like literally stuck on a rock in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, where we can just we find a way to all get along. People in Hawaii are known for the aloha spirit. We're very friendly, we're very warm, we like to do barbecues and play ukulele and go to the beach and laugh a lot and smoke pakalolo, right? So it's just a very chill kind of environment. And it's also been something that has been established through kind of the historical evolution of Hawaii, with different immigrant groups coming and working on the coffee plantations, working on the pineapple farms, hunting, that kind of thing. And so a lot of people just mixed it up. A lot of the communities, they had families together, they talked to each other, they hung out. And so it wasn't a very segregated community, right? Everyone kind of blended in and mixed it up, and our foods combined. We got local mocos, we got plate lunch, we got the Hawaiian Asian fusion. So all of this is pretty like normal and standard. So when I moved to the mainland, I was very surprised and shocked and very uncomfortable when people started talking about race and DEI content. It took me a really long time to wrap my head around what the heck people were talking about, because It still is talking about race and ethnicity and identity, but not at all in the same vibe as the local style that I came from, So yeah,
You mentioned not having that segregation in Hawaii. There's more mixing. So I'm just thinking out loud if that's one of the factors that enables a better integration of all that pluralism, is if there is a lack of segregation or minimal segregation. Would you say that there's any one group of people or groups of people who have more power over others in Hawaii?
great question. So this is where it gets very interesting and very complex and very much breaks with the mainland mainstream narrative, right? So this is how I look at it. And it's probably changed since I was a kid. It's definitely changed from the 50s and 60s, but here's the breakdown. So historically, after World War II and there was the Greatest Generation, there the Japan, like my great grandfather Kanesaburo Oshima fought in or was killed in a Japanese internment camp, but a lot of Japanese people joined the 442nd and 100th Battalion and went to fight the Nazis in Europe and so forth, got the GI Bill, came back to Hawaii, went to college, rebuilt their businesses, became prominent community leaders, got into politics and education. So the Japanese have had historically very prominent influence in Hawaii. So in terms of socioeconomic standing, prominent leaders in the political and business and civic communities, I would say Japanese people have historically had a lot of influence, probably a little bit less in 2025, but historically that's been probably the case. It's interesting because Hawaiian people, local guys, local people, Filipino Hawaiian community, they, in terms of socioeconomic metrics, probably don't score as high as Haole people or Asian people in Hawaii, but they have probably more
And just to
cultural
be
power.
clear, when you
Yeah.
say haole, do you mean
Oh,
white?
sorry, white people.
Okay.
Yeah,
Haoles are the whites.
Haoles
Okay.
are the whites in Hawaii, right?
Okay. Okay. Please go on.
So yeah, so Hawaiian local people have kind of a cultural power or cultural prestige. So it's kind of so when I was going to school as a kid, being Hawaiian was kind of considered like the coolest thing. Like if you're Hawaiian, some of the teachers were Hawaiian, you were kind of pedestalized in a way, implicitly. So more cultural influence, but maybe less direct socioeconomic influence. And then in terms of white people, Haole people, probably kind of a combination of both. But some white people, Haole people, have experienced a lot of like discomfort and discrimination and going to the beach and Hawaiian people looking at them weird, right? Or this whole like beat up Haole day at Koinawaina Public High School, right? And I had a friend in when I
Eat
was
up haole day.
yeah, that was a thing. It was like a meme. Yeah.
Oh,
So I had a friend from Canada who came when he was like in fifth grade, very, very white. He was from Quebec or something, and he was really bullied and really had a hard time integrating and kind of fitting in. He eventually found his place, kind of getting in with the surfer community and the paddling community, but it's an experience a lot of kids have. So how we think about race, power, sociology in Hawaii, very, very different from the mainland.
so so you did come to the mainland, and that was when? Or did
2016, June
26?
2016.
And you moved directly to Portland?
Yes.
Okay. Okay. From Hawaii to Oregon, Portland specifically, in 2016, a pivotal year. Tell me more about your impressions of life on the mainland in Portland when you came.
Yeah, it was shocking. When we first got here, we were walking down the street. I think it was in Northeast Portland, trying to get food, and I had a thought: did I make a huge mistake moving here? It was just such a different vibe. And there
How
is a kind of
so?
natural connection between Hawaii and the West Coast. A lot of people from Hawaii do move to Washington and Oregon and so forth, but it was just a really strange vibe. And my wife had gotten a job at a nonprofit in downtown Portland that was very, very ultra blue, ultra liberal, ultra left, right? And so that was huge culture shock for both of us. I mean, my wife had lived in Hawaii for 7 years prior to us moving to Portland. She's originally from Michigan, but we're all the ways they were talking about race and identity and all of the language around it. We had both had no idea what systemic racism was, the whole social justice thing, things like microaggressions and implicit bias. And no one in Hawaii, at least when I was there growing up, no one ever talks like that or talks about it like that.
Hmm.
And so that was a huge thing I had to reorient towards. I would say the second thing too is that it seems like maybe this is more of a Pacific Northwest thing or a city thing, but people are pretty comfortable talking about politics and like work meetings and in the nonprofit world, and they'll make comments about it like that. And it's sort of in areas in Hawaii that just wouldn't be the case. I think there was more of a hesitation of like, I shouldn't talk about politics or things like controversial topics openly. But it seems like in Oregon, a lot of people just assume you must be liberal, you must be blue, so I can air whatever opinion I want and not have a kind of a consideration for how that will land with people who don't agree or don't know what you're talking about. And so that was a huge tension from my wife and I that we've had to learn how to navigate.
So you've been in the Pacific Northwest now for going on 9 years. You came from your experiences in Hawaii being Japanese American there. So, what are your thoughts now about race? I'm thinking because, you're not white, you're Japanese American, you're Asian American. Some people might think that you are vulnerable to being marginalized or even oppressed. So what are your thoughts about that and about white privilege and diversity, equity, and inclusion? It's a big question, but I know you
Yeah,
have ideas about that.
absolutely. How much time do we have? Yeah, I could talk about this ad nauseum, but yeah. So where should we start? So will just say this. It's been interesting. It's nice to have a platform to talk about this openly because I don't think I've publicly shared this before. But for a lot of Asian people, I've noticed there is a kind of discomfort existing in the social justice DEI space because at the same, we're not seen or treated as Black people, brown people. We're not really looked at as a marginalized community. Some people use the term instead of people of color or BIPOC, they'll say Black and brown community. And whenever people say that, I'm like, well, does Asian or yellow people fit in there? Or no, like I'm not really sure. And so we kind of exist in a liminal space. There's even this term that I really don't like, but it's a white adjacent. And so the idea is that Asian people have a kind of white adjacent form of privilege so that we're not really considered to get the same kind of, treatment or perception as Black and brown people or people who've had more of a historically rough time in the United States. So it is a weird thing to navigate in that context. In terms of the privilege thing, because you asked about that specifically, I mean, my lens on that is basically that everyone and every identity combination has a certain form of privilege depending on what environment you're in, right? So there are a lot of situations where um I'm not white, but I'm thin, 5'9", 130-pound Asian guy who wears glasses in public. So when I go to protests and de-escalate people, when I meet strangers and ask them if they want to get coffee to talk about polarization, I don't come across as a threat, right? If I was exactly who I was inside, but I was 6'5", bald and tattoos, probably wouldn't land the same way, right? Even if I walked up to someone at a protest, I was like, hey, how's it going? They may immediately view me as a threat, but I don't present as a threat. I would say in my line of work, that is a form of privilege, right? And one thing I feel like needs to be clarified is why talking about these concepts is important in the first place. And to me, it's a very simple thing, right? I think the steelman case for being aware of privilege is that it tends to be a blind spot because our brains orient towards painful things that become salient. That's how we survived, right? So one of the things I would jokingly tell people is I would ask people when I would be in these conversations, I would say, raise your hand if you're aware of your left pinky toe right now. No one would raise their hand. And I say, if your left pinky toe was broken or I came up and stomped on it 2 minutes ago, everyone would have raised their hand. You would have been aware of it because it hurt, right? So when we're not aware of something, sometimes that can be a blind spot. And the joke I always use as a metaphor too is if there was a man or a woman who was really sexy and good looking, and they were giving classes on how to date people, and no one would go to the workshop because it would be like, well, right. So I do think that can be helpful, but I think how it's talked about can lead to a kind of shaming or a kind of dismissing of people's point of view, like, oh, you're privileged or oh, you're coming from a dominant background, so your perspective shouldn't be taken as seriously. And I think that's a huge problem, right? For polarization, for decline of civic trust, people feel silenced, they don't feel like they can speak openly. And this is not only just for white people, but a lot of non-white people, I think, who have more, not even necessarily conservative or red leaning views, but just not 100% agreement with the orthodoxy of DEI or woke types of language and cultural niches. And so it's definitely an interesting space to navigate. And one thing I'll share this as a bonus is one of the mediation centers that basically made my career, East County Resolutions in Gresham, which used to be part of the city of Gresham. And in 2020, right, George Floyd, all of, there was a huge push for Black Lives Matter, and DEI training kind of exploded into the mainstream if they weren't already leading up to that. And so that my mediation center, which was probably a little bit more centrist or red blue balance, being in Gresham than other mediation centers in the greater Portland metro area, there was a huge push to get DEI, some kind of equity informed mediation or something. And I was thinking, ooh, I don't want someone who's like super woke to like hijack this space. So I actually took it upon myself. I said, I'm going to make a DEI training. I'm going to depolarize it and make sure that the most liberal and most conservative people in my mediation community will all like it. And so I did a lot of research, a lot of thinking, a lot of philosophizing, put together a training, led it, and I was really proud that everyone did like it and DM'd me or reached out to me, and including the most MAGA people and the most hyper liberal people were both like, "Hey, that was actually really cool," and kind of gave me a
Oh,
new lens at looking at things. So, yeah, that was fun to look back at that, and it didn't feel. I'll just be honest, it didn't feel totally right to do that. I did it as a kind of strategic move, but I think I learned a lot of good things along the way doing that.
right. What was not right?
It's just not totally aligned with who I am, leading DEI trainings.
Oh.
Yeah, and that yeah,
Right, because it hasn't been a personal concern for you. Diversity, equity, and inclusion. Right, right.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
It's too. I think I get uncomfortable with it because it can feel too ideologically charged and a lot of jargon and a lot of kind of academic lingo that a lot of people, either conservative or working class or unfamiliar with that, can be kind of a turnoff. And so what I've joked about is make woke normal again. As in, I think a lot of the ideas that people are trying to talk about, like biases or privilege or power, a lot of these have normal manifestations that don't land as ideologically heavy. So one example would be this narrative of it's not my job to educate you. That kind of talking
Right.
point or meme. And the way the ideological valence or emotional valence behind it can feel like a huge turn off to people who receive that line to them. Like, oh, tell me about yourself or your experience. It's not my job to educate you, right? The idea behind that talking point is that for people who have had trauma or a difficult time, you don't want to share about your experience with someone because it's painful. And in the same way that if I had experienced a certain form of, let's say, sexual abuse, and someone's getting their PhD in psychology and said, "I'm studying about sexual abuse. Please tell me about all of your sexual abuse history." I might say, thank you for asking, but that's not something I feel comfortable sharing with you. It's a very personal thing. Or maybe I'll share more about that with you when I get to know you more, right? I wouldn't just snap into ideological loaded narrative. It's not my job to educate you, right? But there's some truth to that idea. And so I just wish people would convey those things normally and not in an ideologically loaded way.
Mm. Yeah. Normally.
Yeah.
That sounds right. I'm trying to unpack what that would look like. So, probably very personal, human to human, interaction to interaction. You just deal with people one person at a time, each situation at a time, set aside judgment, and assume the best out of people. Well, nowadays, you live in rural Washington, and how do you do that? What is it like to be Asian American in a predominantly white town?
It's absolutely wonderful. I don't have a lot to say about it because it's been a great experience. My wife and I moved here to Toledo in 2022. So Toledo's about 600 people, very conservative, rural, small town off of I-5. And it's been great. I mean, I had some questions of what it would be like moving here. I did receive some death threats from random people during COVID they thought I was Chinese or whatever. So that was a little weird, but I wasn't totally freaked out about it. I was like, whatever, people have problems, right? Um, But so I did have some questions moving here in 2022, what it would be like. And it's just been great. I mean, my neighbors are wonderful and they fixed my lawnmower and we helped them mow their lawn and they fixed our blah 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 and came over with their tractor to rip out our fence. It's just so many good experiences I've had here. And it's a very small town. And again, it's kind of a scale integration thing, right? Where all a lot of the people in my immediate area, they know me and my wife personally now. You know, they see me with the goats, they see me go for walks. And so there is a more personable get to know you kind of level at a smaller scale. And I feel like things like racism or discrimination are more likely to emerge in larger scale areas with more people who don't interact, right? So if I was in a city that had a lot of people who didn't know me personally, they're more likely to be biased if they don't know me as a person. All of my neighbors here in the town of 500 people, they know me as a person, right? So I really think that that helps a lot, and it's just been a great experience, you know. And I've gone gallivanting around in my previous job with Curevines Global to a lot of conservative events, a lot of MAGA events, a lot of Republican events. You know, it's been great. Evangelical churches, Baptist churches in rural areas. I don't think I've ever received any racism or, you know, anything cringeworthy ever out here. So
Right. So
yeah.
do you think so you're alluding to what I'm calling the magic of the rural setting. And what I mean by that is in a rural setting, there aren't many people, so you do get to know everybody on a very personal level, right? Everyone gets to know each other, everyone relies on one another. You develop close relationships with your neighbors because everyone needs each other, right? Which we forget in the city, where we lose sight of the fact that there is any sort of interdependence or interrelationships between people in the city. We get lost in the volume of people. But in the rural setting, everyone knows each other, so that helps to explain the great experiences that you have because they know you. And it's just interesting to point that out because I know a number of people in the city who are afraid to go to a rural area because they're not white and they're afraid that they're going to be attacked or there'll be, something terrible, a racist action or comment that will come out of that rural setting. And, what would you say to that person who's afraid to go venture out? Is there any sort of advice that you'd give them?
The first thing to say is don't be afraid, and if you are, give me a call and we'll go together. I'll show you a good time. You know, we'll go to the bar, we'll go to church. You know, we'll do all these things. Um, Yeah, I mean, so one thing that's actually really funny is this is seldom said to me explicitly and directly, but one person actually said this explicitly, and other people have insinuated it in these very rural, conservative, MAGA, evangelical, et cetera, spaces I've been in. A lot of people are really excited to see someone who's not white and really excited to actually feel like, because I think, you know, everyone does value diversity to some extent, right? They may not make it an ideological, you know, put at the front of their agenda, but they do value that. And I went to a Joe Kent rally. Joe Kent was one of the main MAGA candidates for Congress. He didn't win, but he ran twice in my district. So I went to a lot of his rallies and events, met this woman who is very conservative, devout Christian. I, you know, did what I did with you, Dimitra. I went and said, "Hey, do you want to get coffee and hang out?" She said, "Yeah." So she invited me over to her house. You know, for all she knows, I could have been an axe murderer or whatever, but 72-year-old lady invited me over to her house, and we started talking. She goes to a very conservative Baptist church in Centralia, and she told me, she's like, yeah, well, we need more diversity at my church, and the makeup of the demographic makeup at her church kind of reflects the broader rural area that we live in. But she's like, yeah, we definitely could use more young people and more people who are like you know. And I've had similar experiences at Republican events where there was a sense of excitement of like, you know, this guy is with us or gets us or is on our side, or we can talk to about certain things. And so I feel like explicitly and implicitly, I actually feel like I was valued showing up at these places.
I imagine some people might be wondering, well, there must be something about you personally that has a disarming effect for others. And I wonder, what could that be? Is it that you don't go with assumptions, right? You don't go with any negative assumptions. Could it be that? Could it be that you don't have a chip on your shoulder? Could it be that you have conservative leanings of your own, culturally. What is it that makes you everybody's friend in settings where you are the minority?
That's a great question. I would say several things because you're talking about first like kind of attitude or internal state. One thing I've learned and some of the biggest personal transformation I've had working with different ideological or political groups and moving between different geographic areas and cultures is that we tend to think that groups we're not a part of, everyone who's a part of a group we're not a part of is the same, right? Like our in group is diverse, but the out group, they're all a bunch of homogenous hive mind drones who are the same. They think the same, eat the same, look the same, right? Obviously, that's not true. Every group is just as diverse as our own friend group. That's called out group bias. And so whenever I go somewhere, I'm like, everyone in the group is a different, unique individual, right? And who knows, maybe some of them are racist or sexist or whatever, right? But like, first, they're not gonna say anything, and second of all, I don't, that's not how most people think. And for me too, it's like, and my job is kind of mixed in with this too, is like even if someone were openly discriminatory, that's exactly the person I would love to have coffee with and talk to them about their background and experiences. And if they get to know me personally, then wouldn't that kind of depolarize or de-escalate or build a bridge? And if one of my heroes is Daryl Davis, right? The black jazz
Oh,
musician who befriended the
yes,
KKK and de-radicalized 200 of them just through friendship and conversation.
yes.
And I believe in that wholeheartedly and will take that opportunity anytime it presents itself. So I think with that attitude and the kind of confidence and cheerfulness and genuine curiosity, I think that might be kind of disarming. Also, the way how I dress and self present, I don't code as someone who's like a activist or a hippie or someone who's really culturally blue who doesn't belong there. And I do have a lot of conservative leanings and policy stances locally. So there is kind of like that common ground I can find people pretty quickly as well.
But you mentioned something. You assume the best out of people, right? You go in assuming that people have a good intention, that people are good, that most of us in any setting, we're not terrible people, we're not awful racists. And even if they are, you want to unpack that. You want to get to know them. You get excited by that. Yeah.
Totally. I go
Um,
looking for them.
Yes, which leads me to my next question, which is that, for the last several years, you have put yourself in certain situations that a lot of people could call crazy. You put yourself right in the middle of riots or, protests that could be turning violent. You've basically put yourself right in the middle of a setting that many people would not do that, right? But you have. Just if you could just say a little bit about what you did in going into, the middle of these spaces, like a violent protest in downtown Portland, and then what did you learn in going there to these spaces? What did you do and what did you learn?
Yeah, absolutely. So, just a little background context. This was part of my job. There are really two goals for me going to these events. The first one was to de escalate acute risks of violence, right? So, this could be Antifa's ready to throw a brick through a window, someone's about to shoot someone else, even just like pepper spray, fist fight. We need to prevent violence because it can spiral and cycle and be a contagious effect. So, we want to interrupt the contagion before that retaliation spiral starts to occur. The second thing was, which was I think the most interesting, was to recruit people to my line of work. And these were called credible messengers. So these were people who had credible and reputable, trusted ties with their respective social circle. And they could leverage that credibility and trust to diffuse and de escalate and depolarize and change the norms and narratives around polarization and violence in their communities that only they could reach. I couldn't pull it off because I'm not credible with anarchists or ex-military or Christian nationalists, etc. But if someone else is, they could do that work for us. So I was looking for these people. I was trying to smoke them out, so to speak, and get coffee with them, see if they'd be a good fit. And they'd be like, "Hey, by the way, do you want a job?" So that was kind of my agenda going to these things. And what I learned really quickly is if you're just calm and curious and want to have a reasonable conversation with someone, even a disagreement, people will respond really well. And I'll share a quick story. Was I was at an LGBTQ event last summer, and there was Antifa there, and the Proud Boys were also there, and an ultra conservative Christian church that was preaching very loudly in a way where the LGBTQ people felt very harassed or threatened or whatever. So things started breaking out. I got in the middle of it, talked to both sides for about 2 hours in the sun, standing on the sidewalk in Vancouver, Washington. And I talked to this one guy kind of on the far right for like an hour and a half, young guy, really big muscles, getting in people's face. And we started talking, and I started gently pushing back on certain things. And one thing I told him was like, look, I understand your whole, we had talked about the Bible and different interpretations of Jesus's message and so forth. And at a certain point, we had kind of developed that rapport and chemistry. And I asked him, what you're doing here is kind of a tough sell. Like you're coming in here preaching hellfire and brimstone to people who probably don't even agree with some of the premises. And he's like, I'm not trying to sell anything. I'm like, yeah, but you know what I mean. He's like, yeah, you have a good point. And I'm like, think about this. I said, how many people have ever talked to you like I'm talking to you now? He's like, literally no one. I'm like, what do you think that is? He's like, I don't know. He's like, I think the Holy Spirit must be moving through you already. I'm like, well, thank you. That's very kind of you. I said, do you want more people to talk to you like I'm talking to you now? And he's like, yeah, I mean, that's the entire reason why we come to these events. I said,
Wow.
okay, so it sounds like your goal is to have people talk to you in a way that's civil, rational, respectful, non-escalatory, and maybe even curious about your worldview. What can you do to increase the likelihood of that happening? Right. And then we started talking about how you talk to people and kind of the impact of that and so forth. And then he's like, hey, this has been a great conversation. And then this is the kicker. He's actually from Hawaii. I'm like, oh my gosh, dude, we got to hang out. So we exchanged phone numbers and we joked about getting local mocos and still keep in touch with him a little bit. And this guy's like Proud Boy, right? So that was one of my more memorable exchanges with someone.
But you made it about how this would benefit them, that person, right? You want people to talk to you. Maybe you planted a seed in his mind. Maybe you could consider talking to people in a different way, in this way instead of that way, because the way you're approaching it is not working, right? You want it to work for you. Yeah.
Exactly. In mediation,
Yeah.
that's called conflict coaching. So in the de-escalation, I often sneak in a little conflict coaching there.
Mhm.
Yeah. And then sometimes if it goes well, I'll have multiple coffee follow-up dates with them and then see if they're a good fit. So I can hire them or have them as a volunteer de-escalator or come to another event with us or tell us more about events in their community that we should know about, or we could support them or plan in advance on how to de-escalate in advance, right? So a lot of helpful information on more creating a more civil environment in the community.
Yeah, so I think what astounds me about your experiences in these very difficult settings is that you were able to come to a place of reason, like calm and reason in what is otherwise an unreasonable space.
Yes. One
Yeah.
thing I'll mention about that really quickly too is, and this is something I teach in my de-escalation workshops, is if you know generally who's going to show up at an event and you can kind of infer what their ideology is about, right? So are they anarchists? Are they Black Panthers? Are they neo-Nazis? Are they Christian nationalists or like Christo-fascists, whatever the new buzzword is these days? And what I would do is I would research for hours in advance about their ideology. I would read books before I showed up at the event. I would watch random obscure podcasts on white supremacist websites about it. And what I would do is I would make a whole bunch of notes of curious, philosophically laden questions that I'm ready to ask them. So by the time I show up at the event, I already have a bunch of really genuinely curious questions that I've prepared to ask them. And these questions are not only questions I'm personally curious about getting, but they're also questions that I feel like make people self-reflect on their own worldview more because they're questions that they never get asked, right? So I'm always thinking, how can I ask people questions that they're not used to thinking about, that get them to think about things in a different way? And that little pause or that little, that's an interesting question. I'm going to have to think about that more. I love that answer. That signals to me that I did my homework. I asked a good question and I was thoughtful and curious.
Right. You're being human with them. You're treating them as people, as humans, and you prepare yourself through your research and to go as a genuinely curious person who wants to get to know them more and help them get to know themselves more.
That's exactly right. And one thing I'll say about that too is that this is another thing I teach in my workshops called curious, not furious, right? So the idea is when you're triggered, angry, frustrated, your nervous system is on high alert, you're in fight or flight. It's very hard to go from that state and leap to empathy, compassion, forgiveness, right? It's much easier to go from that to being curious. Curiosity is like the first step that
Mm.
not only de-escalates them, but it de-escalates yourself. So if you can prime the pump of curiosity as much as you can before showing up, you're already going to be in a state that's more immune to being triggered or flustered, right? Because curiosity becomes a dominant vibe you're leading with that washes away competing emotions like fear, anger, reactivity, etc.
Right. You're giving some good advice because I'm thinking that I'm not going to go to a riot myself, but the next time I go to a gathering with people, with certain people that I don't feel comfortable talking to about politics or some, difficult subject, and I know I could be potentially triggered by that conversation or that person, I could apply what you're doing, at the protests and at the riots to my own private gathering, party, holiday event, do some research, come up with some pretty genuinely curious questions, and then work myself into a space where I can genuinely, authentically ask the curious question. Because I'm just curious, right? Anybody can do that if they try. At least I don't know. Can anybody do that? I don't know.
I would like to think so, and I'll just mention one more concrete technique that I do is after I do my research and generate a whole list of curious questions, I'll then review each question and think two things. Is this question really coming from curiosity, or is there a subtle gotcha or agenda laden within the question? If there is, I'll actually just delete it and come up with a new one sponsored from genuine curiosity. And then also, how is the question worded? So does it feel like a gotcha, or does it feel closed-ended or pointed? And if not, how can I open it up more to maximize the range of responses and openness from the person I'm asking the question to? So after all that prep, you go in there with a roadmap for the conversation, helps to go a lot easier.
Yeah. And by gotcha, you're talking about a leading question that has judgment in it. Like,
Correct.
oh, you wouldn't believe that, would you? Or, oh, come on, like you don't actually think that, do you? Is that what you mean by
Yes,
that?
exactly. Right. How could you believe that? Why on earth would you ever support that candidate? Right. That kind of thing. Yeah.
That kind of thing. Yeah. It's a judgment question. Yeah.
Yes. Where you already know what answer you want to get.
I'm just curious, but as we start to wrap this up, thinking about politics, what do you think that conservative-minded people most often misunderstand about liberal-minded people? And then conversely, what do you think liberal-leaning folks misunderstand about conservative-leaning folks?
Yeah, great question. So there's there's a infinite range of answers one could give on this topic, but I'll just share the things that I found to be most interesting. So starting with the what do Reds tend to understand about blues? I think one interesting thing is I do know a lot of blues who actually do have a lot of patriotism, but the way that the patriotism is expressed is different from conventional associations of patriotism, like American flag, and really patriotic Fourth of July, support the troops, American exceptionalism or whatever. And the critique of the left in regards to patriotism or love of country is that there seems to be a lot of anti-Americanism or criticizing American empire or criticizing American foreign policy or history or what we're doing domestically. And it can come across as being very anti-American. But I think for a lot of blue people, actually, the criticizing the country is because they love their country. And
Mm.
this is a way of trying to improve it, right? Like we need to call out the bad things so that we can move forward. So that's one thing I think I'd like to see more conversation around to kind of bridge that gap. Let's get more radioactive. So when it comes to what blues misunderstands about reds, this is something I think about a lot that I call the ideology identity conflation. So it's
What?
basically the ideology identity conflation. It
Okay.
goes like this. If someone attacks a group or an ideology that's associated with an identity or demographic group, people think you must be attacking the identity or demographic group itself. Example, if you criticize Black Lives Matter as a political movement, or you criticize, let's see, LGBTQ or gender theories or philosophies or ideologies, that must mean that you're attacking trans people or gay people or black people directly. When I think a lot of Reds, when they criticize these movements or ideas, they're criticizing the movement and the ideas. They're not criticizing the movement or ideas, or sorry, the people associated with those movements or ideas, right? And so, and it could also be that by more broadly criticizing the movement or ideas, that there's a lot of other people on the left who are not part of that identity group. So, like a lot of white people support Black Lives Matter. A lot of non-LGBTQ people support some of the gender philosophies or theories out there, right? And so it's really not about targeting the identity group, right? It's criticizing the movement or the ideas that are associated with or advocating for that identity group. And I think that's something that I like to see more discussion around to try to clear up that misunderstanding.
So you're talking about people taking things personally. So, right, if you criticize a belief or a value or an idea, a philosophy, an ideology, then people conflate that with themselves. Like, oh, now you're criticizing me, right?
Yes.
But you're saying that's a mistake. No, we have to detach between the ideology, the value, belief, what have you, and the people involved. They're like, in other words, we can't take it so personally. They're two different things.
That's exactly right. And I think when you don't make that distinction, it's very easy to jump to the conclusion. You attack Black Lives Matter, you must be racist, right? You attack some of the gender theories or trans theories, you must be homophobic, right? And it's like, I think that's the gap that needs to be bridged. Is no, I'm taking issue with the how the movement is run or the leadership or some of the specific ideas that tend to be polarizing. I have nothing against Black people or trans people or whatever, right?
Right. My last question is in our very divided society right now, what can ordinary people like me and you do to make a difference to reduce toxic polarization?
Great question. And I always have one go-to answer, and that's get out of your echo chamber. Get out
Right.
of your bubble, get out of the echo chamber, be uncomfortable, and break bread with people that you don't normally socialize with. I think that is the single most important thing we can all do collectively. And if you scale that up, we will heal the country. And this goes all the way back to how we started the conversation about segregation, right? And there's all these books and research and papers on like things like how civil wars begin. And you're Greek and you understand the Greek Civil War. You told me that story about your own family. And when there's a tremendous amount of ethnic or economic or cultural or ideological segregation in society, it becomes way easier to other people, becomes way easier to think that they're less than or less than human or something. But when the more interaction we have with people that we disagree with or that come from a different background than we do, A, we become more resilient to conflict and disagreement. We become less fragile. B, we get to know people better. And C, we get to be on the same wavelength regarding how we view the world and the information that we have. And I don't think democracy or civil society can really function well when everyone's balkanized into their own little echo chamber and informational universe. If we don't mix it up, then I think we're headed towards hyperpolarization, more violence. And so the best thing to prevent that is to just mix it up, even if that means doing things or initially feel a little awkward. I encourage people just try to go to a barbecue or a picnic or an event where you meet people very different from you and just see what it feels like. And if you can make friends and break bread and go get coffee and get to know each other as a person, I think if a lot of people do that, the country will be in a lot better place.
Well said, Ryan. Well said. I guess I said that was my last question, but now I have a tiny follow-up question, which is that if I'm afraid to do that, if I feel personally just afraid to go to that barbecue, break bread, any advice for me on how to get past my fear?
Sure. So a couple things. One would be first looking at why you're afraid and what assumptions you have about the people that you're going to talk to. And if you can deconstruct those biases and inquire, where did I, so if I have a certain group or image of someone in mind, just think, where did I pick up that image? Is it a stereotype? Is it a caricature? Was it from the media? Right? Deconstruct all of the assumptions you have about the outgroup, about them, and then see what happens, right? The second thing is also, do you know anyone who could make an introduction for you, right? Do you have any friends who you could say, hey, I'm not really comfortable cold calling or outreaching or walking into a bar or Antifa rally or evangelical church or whatever that I don't know anyone there. do you know someone there that you can kind of facilitate a warm handoff or introduction for me or go with me to this? And that can also help to kind of lubricate the social wheel and kind of get people to, talk each other in a way that feels more comfortable because we have a trusted friend bridging that gap, not me just doing it with someone I don't know at all.
This has been a great conversation. And
Yes, I agree. Thank you, Dimitra. Always a pleasure to talk to you.
thanks for taking out the time. Thanks again also to everyone listening. If you'd like more information about Braver Angels, please go to our website, braverangels.org. And to find out about local events in Oregon, please go to braverangels.org/Oregon.
You know I love you.
Music for this episode is Hello, I Love You, written by Ben Karen and Leo Gallo, and performed by Ben Karen, Fadine Keelty, Ray Cole, Nathan Heldman, Oscar Bugarin, and Mary Keating. Watch this and other songs by Ben Karen on youtube.com/Ben Karen Creates. That's BenCaroncreates. Thanks to Ben and team for allowing us to use this song.
Creation was one nation born in harmony. I choose how I perceive. I choose how this will be.